I'm conscious of time, so I'll try and speak quickly, and I'll probably flick through some of the slides a little bit quicker than I planned to do, so that we still have some decent time. I'm sure you're all sitting with lots of questions and answers sort of building up. So I'll talk a little bit about governance across sectors, some key points of focus on governance, some things that I really want you to kind of think about when you're thinking about governance, and then finally some challenges for you as a sort of sector. And one thing I wanted to sort of just say at the beginning, I always see governance as something rather exciting and sexy, and I never really understand why people think it's this dry, old, fusty subject. For me, it's about how people work together, it's about dynamics, it's about cultures, it's about leadership cultures, and it's about the efficacy of your outcome. So you're charged with some kind of long-term objectives, and actually key to your success in achieving those is the quality of your decision making, the quality of challenge, the thinking, the sense making that you have in the boardroom. So that's the stuff that drives me and that makes me excited. So forgive me if I start to sound a bit passionate about it. So as Judith said earlier, you know, part of the new sports strategy written into that is the proposal to introduce a new code of governance for sporting organisations. And at the moment you have a kind of voluntary code, which I'll sort of touch on a little bit later on. And what I'd say about governance when we look across sectors, whether we look at the private and corporate sector, whether we look at other not-for-profit organisations, if we look at education, if we look at health, if we look at social housing, if we look at social care, if we look at the charitable sector, we can see that actually nobody's got governance quite right. And so that makes me start to ask questions about what is it about decision making at a high level? Why do we sometimes get things wrong? We manage to get clever people around tables, and nevertheless we have sort of scandals, furores, fiascos, disappointments, lack of transparency, lack of accountability. What is it that sometimes goes wrong? So we're always on a journey. I think governance is a kind of vanishing point in the distance. We're always trying to have better governance. And I think there's a restlessness that we need to have at board level about excellence in governance. If you think you've arrived, you probably haven't. You're probably not a board that's very self-aware. The really great organisations, the ones that really invest in their governance, are always inquiring, always asking questions about how do we do things better? Are we performing? Are we adding value? How are we measuring our impact and our outcomes? And not just getting embroiled into the kind of day-to-day operations of their organisations. If we look across sectors, I did a piece of work for the Welsh Government a few years ago looking at governance across housing associations in Wales, and as part of that work I did a kind of literature review on governance, and actually what I noticed looking across about sort of 10 sectors is that the basic tenets of good governance are there for everyone to see. We should all know them. You know, in a way it doesn't matter which sector you're looking at, which code you're reading, there'll always be something about clarity of roles and responsibilities. And it's interesting when I look at the sports sector sometimes, there seems to be a real lack of understanding sometimes actually in some organisations about the primacy of the board role. So sometimes there'll be council and membership structures, and there'll be this sort of confusion about who is actually driving strategy. Well, there shouldn't be any confusion. The board should always be driving strategy. So there's a primacy about the role of the board that we have to recognise. And there's a kind of clarity of the ask of individual board members that we also need to make really clear. I think the role of a board member has changed over the last 10 years. I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. We need to think carefully about how we recruit people to boards. So whatever their routes to board membership, and you may have membership structures that create certain kind of pathways, nevertheless the process of appointment to boards should always be something that engages people in thinking about skills and competences. So you shouldn't just be a recipient in the board structure for people being sort of plonked onto the board. Tenure is a really important trait across governance codes. So making sure that there's real kind of renewal and refreshing of the board. And a new sort of focus on skills across all sectors, which I'll sort of talk about in a minute. So whichever sector we're looking at, there's a good governance package. We all ought to know what that looks like. And it's about the challenges of trying to put that into practice and make that work better in some way. When I look across the last decade, I've been doing governance for just over 10 years. I can see a real sort of sea change, actually, and particularly in the not-for-profit organisations, but also in the corporate sector since 2008. And I say one of the things that we see in the kind of not-for-profit sectors, including the sports sector, is a kind of professionalisation of the board member role. So whether you're paid or you're not paid, it's no longer about a sort of voluntary hobby. It's not just about doing good. It's not just something where you sort of pitch up for 4 meetings, read the papers in front of you and drift away again. It's much more of a kind of nesting activity. You're not dipping in and out of the organisation. You're somehow always engaged. They're somehow always in your head in some way. You're carrying the kind of mission and vision of purpose of that organisation with you all the time. I'm a non-executive in a couple of places. I don't get paid to do those roles, but I'm always thinking about those organisations through my day-to-day work and thinking about things that might make a difference to how we're addressing some of the challenges that we need to address. So we see professionalisation of that role, a much stronger focus on skills. So it's no longer just about sort of stakeholder boards, about putting together kind of composite groups of sort of customers or members and maybe having, sort of one independent there. It's much more about saying, actually, what we need is skills and competency-based boards, and some of those people will be people who bring the articulation of a member or customer experience, but they're not representing it. And I think sometimes in the not-for-profit organisations, we get confused about the words representation and sort of membership. They're not the same thing. You can't sort of be a board member and be trying to represent a whole load of sort of voting people. You're there on the board as a board member. That's the primacy of your role. You're thinking about the best interests of the organisation, not all of the interests of the people who may have nominated and elected you. You may articulate their experiences, you may help think about the reception of strategy for them, but actually your role on the board is to be the board member. We're also seeing across sectors the value of sort of diversity at board level, and this isn't just about protected characteristics, although that's important. It's also about the diversity of thought, of skills and experience. So if we look at the 2008 financial crisis, if we look at what happened in banks and financial institutions, we get lots of lessons about groupthink. If we look at Kids Company, some board members there for long periods of tenure, again, a certain kind of culture of coziness, comfort, complacency at board level. So terms of office for board members are really important, but also bringing in fresh blood, bringing in people, a little bit of grit in the oyster. There's a danger sometimes that we start to get so good at governance that it becomes very consensual, very courteous and very nice, and nobody wants to disagree with anybody else. I like boardrooms where there's really sort of vigorous but polite debate and a real exploration of different assumptions and options to make sure that we're getting the best quality decision making out of the boardroom. We're also seeing a shrinking of board size. So again, if we think about not-for-profit organisations, that kind of stakeholder composition board has sometimes meant very large board sizes, 15, 20. Now board size is shrinking to sort of 12 and underneath 12. So sort of between 8 and 12 is becoming more of a norm. And again, there's something there where the sort of not-for-profit organisations are sort of mirroring, if you like, some of the patterns that we see in the kind of corporate sector. I think in terms of our time commitment as board members, it's changed considerably over the last 10 years. There are even little bits of research that support that, and to say that actually the Corn Ferry Institute did a little sample of sort of role descriptions and job descriptions for board members and found that over sort of a period of 5 years in the noughties, that A, the time commitment had increased considerably, and B, the ask of people's kind of financial understanding and understanding of risk had also changed quite considerably over that sort of 5 years. We're seeing a stronger attention towards culture and dynamics. So it's not just about the rules and the processes and the constitutional documents and the papers in front of you. It's about how you interact together. And there's some really interesting research coming out of the States about the smartness of teams that says, the really effective teams are the ones where 2 or 3 experts speak for long periods of time and everybody else shuts up, but rather where everybody in the room is really engaged for short periods of time, making short contributions, really responding to each other, and actually they're finding that women are a really important part of some of the smartness of those teams, maybe because they're used to these bits of having to sort of respond and react, some richer kind of communication skills among some of them from this sort of research around the smartness of teams. So it's about the interplay in the boardroom. It's about our level of engagement and connection. It's about not just sitting waiting to ask the question that you've sort of been sitting on for 10 or 15 minutes, but actually listening to what other people people are saying and trying to engage in some kind of discussion and debate. So we really need to attend to that when we're thinking about quality governance. What's the quality of discussions that we're having in the boardroom? How much room is there on the agenda? How ruthless are you about the agendas in giving you that kind of time to have sort of rich strategic conversations? So we're seeing this across sectors when we look at some of the trends. I've talked a little bit about skills. I just want to say, I recognise some of you will have, complex kind of structures sitting around your board. For some of you, very sort of complex membership organisations. It will always matter to have some process of assessment for who comes to the board. Whatever the pathways to board membership, there are ways of saying we have a proper appointments process that's about competency and skills. Don't conflate representation with board membership. I see it a lot in sports organisations, and it's something where I end up trying and tease apart the different definitions of what it means to be elected or nominated by other people, and actually what does it mean to be a board member. You can't be a representative on the board. You're a member of the board. You're acting in the best interest of the organisation. You may bring a hinterland of experience with you, but actually your main your legal duty is to act in the interest of the organisation around whose board table you sit. It's a really important distinction, and I actually try and avoid the word representative, because I don't think it's a helpful term. You can't possibly represent thousands of people. There are other ways that you as boards should be demanding data about the voices and experiences and demography and behaviours and all of those other things about thousands of people, not through one individual. I've mentioned a little bit the importance of the culture in the boardroom and the importance of challenge. You need that little bit of grit in the oyster. You need to be having sort of vigorous debates. Challenge isn't just about responding to the homework that's put in front of you. Sometimes I speak to boards and they think it's about, we asked a few questions about the numbers or the KPIs or something else. Challenge is a much broader thing. It's about how questions are framed. It's about how problems are solved. It's about whether you're asking the right questions in the first place when you're looking at your longer term strategy. And we can see that there are some real sort of seismic shifts in how you need to be thinking as organisations at the moment. So you need to be making space for a different kind of type of conversation in the boardroom about how do we respond to this new governance strategy? How do we respond to Sport England's expectations? Where do we position ourselves in this new landscape? Who are our new partners, potentially, etc., etc. You can't have effective challenge. And again, if you look at things like the Keogh report into hospital trusts, if you look at Ofsted reports, if you look at reports from the Charity Commission, you have to understand the business that you're sort of working in. And that isn't just at a cursory level. It's really understanding for you some of the nudges around behaviour, some of the, what is it that will move people along that kind of participation ladder in some way. So this is about a much deeper process of thinking. You need to understand what it is that's going to drive different sort of outcomes and a stronger impact for your organisation. And you need to understand the risks of not being successful in some areas. Where can you afford to have a high appetite for risk? Where can you afford to invest in something and for it to fail because you might learn something from it? And where can you not afford to have a high appetite for risk? Housekeeping. This is my father's onions, which he liked to sort of count before he sort of strung them up. What I would say is good organisations have great housekeeping. I always know that there are going to be some problems with a board when I start to ask for various documents and I get different versions of things. A version that's still got track changes in, another one that's called version 4.5, nearly finished version, another one that says the finished version, and so on and so on. There's something, or organisations that take a long time to send me documents. It starts to create a slight alarm for me about where is the housekeeping that's sitting behind this. The housekeeping matters because somewhere along the way you'll be reporting to investors, funders, potentially regulators, and actually the quality of the paperwork that's being returned and actually the quality of data that you're assessing and considering as board members really matters for you to make effective decisions. I find it helpful to think about 3 modes of governance. So when I was doing the research for the Welsh Government, I came across a book by Chait, Ryan and Taylor, and suddenly there was something about the language of that book that connected with my experience of working with boards. So they talked about 3 modes of governance: the fiduciary, the strategic, and what they called the generative, and I call the creative. And then since then, some of that sort of thinking has developed into some other concepts. So The oversight role, lots of boards do this well. The checking, the sentinel, the kind of watch person, looking at the figures, checking things. And many boards think that their role is just about that sort of oversight bit. But it's not. It's also about foresight. It's about looking down a kind of lens and saying, what's coming in 5 years' time? Where are we positioned for that? What kind of impact and outcomes do we want to have in 5 years' time? How do we need to diversify our income? What do we need to be doing now? What does that phasing look like? What kind of resources do we need to support that? Where's our kind of scenario planning? Who else do we need to be collaborating with? What's our kind of stakeholder relationship sort of strategy, etc., etc.? You cannot just be an effective board member and acting in the here and now and reacting to things that are put in front of you. You need to be stepping back. Your role is to be slightly distanced from the organisation, slightly distanced from the day-to-day stuff, and bring that quality of independence and objectivity to bear on trying to think about the longer-term impact and outcomes for the organisation. And the third thing that I think about is sort of insight. So this is about the board's role in making sense of the organisation. What are you there to do? How do you best deliver it? Are you structured in the right way to achieve those things? And I think particularly when there are complex, changing environments, as you're in at the moment, there's a kind of certain sort of board agility that's required. There's a certain new space that you need to find for sort of bigger, wider discussions, bigger questions that you need to be asking in the boardroom. And it's actually one of the things, I think, when boards are operating more in the foresight and insight roles, it's the time when you start to feel as a board member that you're really making a difference, that actually this is about the quality of thought, it's about sense-making for the executive in the boardroom. You're actually bringing your sort of wider skills and experience to sort of really bear and trying to ask intelligent questions. It's not always about giving advice and guidance, it's sometimes about probing assumptions and options and wider sort of thinking. Whoops. So it really matters as board members that you think about how you design your governance menu, that you aren't just passengers on it, you aren't just visitors in the boardroom to meetings, to committee meetings, but rather that you take an active role in being proactive, in sitting down as a board team and saying, do we need to work differently? Have we got the right frequency of meetings? Do we have enough space in our agendas for sort of quality discussions? Do we need a different kind of committee? In this kind of changing environment, do we need some more fluidity about governance working? Do we need some task and finish groups around certain areas? How are we thinking about governance? So you need to surface conversations about how you actually design your work and not just be, as I said, sort of passengers in terms of your own sort of board journey. And when I look at really effective boards, I can sort of see a fluency about board language, that there's a group of people who really understand, how they're interpreting their organisation, how they're looking at its longer term sort of strategy and objectives, what kind of impact they're looking to deliver, who they think they need to work with, what kind of risks might sort of, upset that journey. And it's there across all of the board. There's a kind of rich seam, a sort of threshold of proficiency and of shared language that I see as a kind of marker of sort of excellence in governance in some way. So just thinking about where you are as a sector now, where's your state of readiness? Well, I'd say, there's been a lot of progress over the last few years, and I think, in a way, Sporting gave you some challenges as organisations to say we really want governance to evolve and change. You've had a sort of voluntary code in the sector as well. I'm not sure how many of you have been using that. It's a kind of soft entry into governance. It's some of it is kind of, about the kind of concepts of governance without necessarily making you do things. And I think what's going to make the difference in terms of raising the bar is now going to be some firmer prescription and requirements of organisations receiving public funding. And some of that will have to be about sort of board skills, about board tenure, about board diversity in some way. And I think, some sort of, comply or explain code, I'm not sure where Sport England's thinking is at the moment on its new code of governance, but, this is the kind of thing that we see across other sectors where organisations are in receipt of public money and have some form of accountability sort of indirectly to the taxpayer, as it were. So I think, this is a really interesting time for you as a sector. I think we're very aware, all of us, of the kind of high-profile sort of public failures around governance, including in sort of, international sporting organisations. And I think this is a real moment for a whole range of organisations, whether they're big or small, to really demonstrate that they have the appetite to have much stronger governance because they're interested in delivering those sort of broader strategic outcomes and being really brilliant at doing that. Thank you.